The cellar beneath the old Dallin orphanage wasn't part of the tour. It hadn't been used in decades, not since the state condemned the building in 1901. But in the fall of 1899, as workers cleared out the last of the furniture before demolition, one of them noticed a loose board behind the coal chute. Behind it, the cellar stretched deeper than expected, and at the far end, leaning against the damp, flaking brick, was a portrait. Nearly 4 feet wide, its frame was cracked in 2 places, warped from decades of humidity. The faces, however, were perfectly preserved. 20 children, frozen in eerie stillness, encircled Elias and Katharina Dallin, seated like royalty in the center. The children stared forward, none smiling, all positioned as though chosen. Their clothes were neat but strangely mismatched, some in Sunday collars, others barefoot. Every pair of eyes seemed aware of something they weren't allowed to say. The portrait bore no inscription, no year, no artist's signature, no names. Only a faint ring of ash beneath the lower corner, as if someone had once tried to burn it, then stopped. It was town historian Edwin Larch who first documented the painting. He'd been asked to collect archival materials before the orphanage was torn down. When he saw the portrait, something in him recoiled. But his job was preservation. He had it carried to his office in the Brackenthorpe Historical Society and propped it on the far wall. He stared at it every day for nearly 3 weeks. The longer he looked, the more he noticed. One child in the portrait had 6 fingers on her left hand, but no child in any of the orphanage's enrollment logs mentioned a deformity. Another appeared twice. Same eyes, same scar on the neck, once on the left in a smock and again in the rear wearing a boy's jacket. One boy near the edge had no irises at all, just gray circles, empty and clean. Edwin checked the light, the varnish, the brushwork. It was not a trick. And still, no names. Not even a list in the back of the frame. Not a note tucked behind the canvas. He began digging through town archives. The Dallins were celebrated figures in late 19th century Massachusetts, educators, philanthropists, reformers of child labor laws. Their orphanage had won awards. But Edwin soon discovered that every article, every speech, every record repeated the same names, Elias and Katharina. Never the children. There were no photos, no personal journals, no gravestones, no names. Edwin requested the original staff logs, but they'd been lost in a fire in 1902. The only surviving documents were tax forms and state grant applications. Even those were odd. In several years, the number of registered children fluctuated wildly. 35 one year, then 16, then back to 42 with no explanation. He visited the town cemetery hoping to find stones for any of the children. There were 12 in the Dallin plot, all small, unmarked. He returned to the portrait. This time he noticed the details behind the figures. The left wall bore a faint series of lines, almost too faded to see, like tally marks in groups of 5. The floor beneath one child's chair was stained darker than the rest. Another had her shoe on backward, but only on one foot. The central rug formed a circle. Too perfect, too symmetrical. He began sketching diagrams, trying to map the children's positions. When he overlaid their arrangement with an old architectural blueprint of the orphanage's main floor, the locations matched the interior rooms, especially the restricted wing that had no door from the main hall. Each child aligned with a room. Some rooms had never been documented. The deeper he went, the more he stopped sleeping. In his journal, Edwin wrote, "They weren't students. They were subjects, each placed like an object in an experiment, each posed like they knew it." 3 weeks later, Edwin Larch resigned from the Historical Society. He was last seen at the Brackenthorpe Library, tearing pages from an anatomy textbook and crying. The portrait remains in storage, covered, unnamed, undisturbed. But under the corner of its frame, someone once scratched a single phrase into the wood, so faint it's almost gone. They were never meant to be remembered. Elias Dallin arrived in Brackenthorpe on a Sunday morning in the spring of 1869. He wore polished boots that hadn't touched dirt, carried a leather case lined with ink pots and brass dividers, and spoke with the confidence of a man who had been heard before. He said he was a linguist, said he'd traveled across Prussia and the Ottoman provinces studying how language shaped behavior. His wife, Katharina, arrived 1 week later with no luggage and no clear accent. She barely spoke, but he made up for it. The town was small, 600 residents, mostly farmers and mill workers, but Elias made quick work of introductions. He spoke at the church about the power of phonemes. He lectured school teachers on the dangers of letting children name themselves. He warned that naming too early locked a child into fixed thought. Language, he said, is architecture for the soul. You build a child by controlling the words they live inside. People clapped. They didn't understand him, but they liked how he made them feel smarter. He said he'd start a school. Not just a school, an academy. One that would rescue abandoned children from moral collapse and shape them into thinkers. He offered to fund the construction himself, then asked only for state grants to cover books and bread. It was modest, persuasive. The town council approved the plans within 2 weeks. Land was cleared at the north end of the valley and construction began on what would be called the Dallin Academy. But Elias had no traceable past. He listed no birthplace on his state registration. The name Dallin did not appear on any ship manifest, census, or marriage certificate prior to 1869. The Boston offices searched for academic credentials. No university in Europe or the Americas had record of him. He claimed this was deliberate, that he had discarded his old name in protest. A name, he told the notary, is a leash unless earned. His curriculum reflected that belief. When the first children arrived, 6 in total, all orphans from surrounding counties, Elias rejected their given names. He told each one, "Your parents no longer own you. Their words no longer define you." He assigned new names based on observation. One boy became Steady. A girl was called Soft. Another child known to flinch during meals was named Twitch. The name stuck, and because he banned the use of former names entirely, even among the children, they eventually forgot what they'd once been. Locals began to whisper about it, not with fear yet, but with discomfort. Parents wondered aloud why the children never visited town, why they stopped making noise when adults passed the academy gates. But Elias remained charming, methodical, tireless in his work. He wrote essays published in small journals claiming that the reshaping of identity required not just discipline, but ritual. He argued that children should not be told who they are, but taught how to become unnamed, free of inherited structure so they could be rebuilt from silence. He spoke often of silence. The only known photograph of Elias during those early years shows him in profile, one hand raised as if mid-sentence, the other holding a book with no title. Behind him, a chalkboard bears strange glyphs, neither Greek nor Latin, though he claimed they were proto-linguistic constraints. A student beside him looks half asleep. Her eyes are open but unfocused. Her mouth is slightly parted, as if waiting to be told whether she's allowed to speak. By 1871, 22 children were enrolled at the Dallin Academy. The state approved a second round of funding after Elias submitted a report claiming measurable progress in categorical obedience. When asked why his reports listed no surnames for any of the children, he replied in handwriting firm and sharp, "Because obedience has no lineage." Privately, the town clerk recorded something stranger. Elias had submitted paperwork for a planned expansion of the school, but when asked to confirm his identity for legal documentation, he refused to sign his full name. Instead, he placed a small mark, a symbol almost like a rune. When asked why, he said, "To name myself again would be to chain what I've already freed." By the time anyone questioned his origin, it was already too late. The building stood. The children were enrolled. The rituals had begun. Elias Dallin had no past to trace and no name to reclaim. Only the authority to erase others, and the charm to make people thank him for it. Inside the walls of the Dallin Academy, silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was law. From the moment each child crossed the gate, their birth name was stripped from them like a garment no longer fit to wear. There were no introductions, no roll calls. The moment a child responded to their former name, they were punished. Not physically, not loudly, but with something worse. Erasure. They would be placed alone in the chapel hall, seated before a mirror for hours, forced to stare at their reflection while a metronome ticked beside them. Tick, 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 until their sense of identity blurred with the beat and dissolved into obedience. Each child received a new name within their first week, what Elias Dallin called a house assignment. These names were not given with warmth but as markers of compliance. The quiet ones who followed instruction without question earned gentle names. Grace. Still, noble. Children who spoke out of turn, asked too many questions, or resisted routines were reclassified with names like rot, mute, snare, or wait. These names were spoken during public meals, etched into their plates, sewn into the collars of their uniforms. There were no exceptions. Even among one another, the children were warned, "Speak a forbidden name, and yours will be burned." The concept of burning a name was never explained directly, but the children understood. When a boy once whispered his sister's birth name during chores, the entire dormitory was awakened that night. They were marched down to the chapel where Elias stood beside a hearth. The boy's uniform name tag was removed and tossed into the fire. He was given a new name, Ash. For the next month, he was forbidden to sit at any table or touch any book. He slept without blankets. He never spoke again. Katharina enforced the naming rituals in more quiet, insidious ways. She kept a ledger, unmarked from the outside, where she recorded name changes in red ink. The ink was her own formula, homemade, thick and metallic. Some said it resembled dried blood more than dye. Each page bore columns labeled sound, sin, and correction. She said the children's spoken errors polluted their shape, that if a child called himself something unearned, the sound itself would deform him. She spoke this with the tenderness of a mother folding linens. The rules around silence were reinforced with routine drills. During mealtime, children were instructed to hum a single unified tone. No talking, no chewing sounds, just the low, droning hum of 60 children forced to make the same sound at the same pace. Anyone who broke rhythm was told to rise, walk to the front of the room, and recite a phrase into a large brass funnel embedded in the wall. I relinquished the lie. It was unclear what the funnel was connected to, but afterward the child's voice always sounded slightly different, like it had been pressed through a filter. There were older children who remembered their real names. At first, but they kept them tucked deep, whispered only in dreams. One girl, whose fingers bore the calluses of a farmer's daughter, wrote her birth name into the dust beneath her bed frame. A week later, her entire mattress was removed. She slept on the floor for 60 nights, then was reassigned to a basement dorm called the Unspeaking Wing. She returned once during spring meal, and the other children didn't recognize her at first. She'd been renamed Grain. When she looked up, her eyes didn't search. She only moved when told. Elias claimed the system was working, that the children had become quieter, more attentive, more malleable. His reports to the state were glowing, full of words like cognitive pliancy and linguistic reset. But the townspeople had begun to notice the absence of laughter near the academy. No songs drifted from the windows. No chalk scribbles were ever seen on the paths. Children used to whistle when walking to church. Now they walked in pairs, in silence, their mouths tight, their feet perfectly in sync. Inside the Dallin Academy, identity was not a right. It was a variable, assigned, adjusted, punished, or revoked, and once a name was taken, it never returned. Even in dreams, the children stopped calling out. The silence grew deep, institutional, inescapable. The demolition of the Dallin Academy began on a gray morning in March 1901. The building had sat empty for 2 years, condemned by the state for structural instability and fire risk. Crews were instructed to begin at the western wing, the section furthest from the chapel, and work inward. On the second day, as they removed rotted flooring near the east corridor, a floorboard gave way beneath a worker's boot. He fell 6 feet and broke his wrist. When others rushed to lift him out, they saw it. A stairwell, narrow and steep, leading down into earth that wasn't listed on any blueprint the town held in its archives. The space hadn't been touched in decades. Dust fell in veils through broken beams, and the air was sour, thick with dampness and the faint copper stink of old metal. The workers brought lanterns, descended slowly, and reached a door that looked like it had never been meant to open from the inside. It was steel-banded and painted black, though the paint had peeled away in flakes like dried bark. A large brass latch sealed it shut. There was no knob, only a thin vertical slot in the center, just wide enough for a slate or sheet of paper. Someone had once used it as a delivery chute. When the door was forced open, the men recoiled. The room was wide, perhaps 20 feet across, and held 11 desks, all bolted to the floor in semicircle formation. The wood at their bases was scorched, blackened around the feet as if fire had licked them over and over but never consumed them. The walls were covered in a matte black coating, charred, not painted. Yet no smell of soot remained. No evidence of a single contained fire. The burn marks stopped precisely at shoulder height, forming a sharp horizontal line. Above it, the plaster was clean. There was no chalkboard, no books, but each desk had a small inset plate where something had once been mounted. The size was uniform, about 4 inches across, like a slot for a metal disc or badge. Most had been removed. Only one remained. A round plate etched with a single letter, V, and beneath it in tiny script the word, vessel. The plate was cold to the touch, bolted in with 4 rusted screws. One of the men unscrewed it and pocketed it. He would later be found muttering the same word to himself for days before returning it and refusing to speak of it again. In the far corner of the subterranean room, half concealed behind a draped sheet of moldy canvas, was something worse. A chute, carved directly into the foundation. It dropped vertically and out of sight, about 3 feet wide. No ladder, no grate, just smooth brick slick with residue and a smell that hadn't faded. The workers lowered a lantern tied to rope. The light disappeared at 20 feet. When they pulled it back up, the glass was cracked and the flame had extinguished. The official report filed to the Brackenthorpe Council listed it as an unrecorded storm drain with signs of academic equipment. But the room had no drainage, no piping, no ventilation. The floor was too smooth, the symmetry too deliberate. One man later said it felt like a theater designed for one observer and many acts of suffering. Not loud suffering, something quieter, something refined. The blueprints had shown nothing beneath the east wing. No lower level, no stairwell. The original architect, long deceased, had kept meticulous records, and none included the black classroom. Yet when demolition continued and walls were removed, another anomaly emerged. Soundproofing. Hidden behind the inner walls of the East Wing were layers of compacted cloth, waxed paper, and cedar, an early form of acoustic insulation. Expensive, difficult to install, absolutely intentional. The town council ordered the stairwell sealed. Bricks were laid. The door was chained shut before the final wall came down. But not before one last photograph was taken. Grainy, blurred, poorly lit. In the corner of the image, the desks form a semicircle facing an empty wall. And though no people are present, the blackened shapes around each desk seem to lean inward, just slightly, like they're waiting for someone to speak. It was decades after the orphanage closed when the first testimony emerged. The voice belonged to a woman nearly 80 years old, frail, her memory failing in pieces. But one image remained sharper than any others: the spoon. She had been 8 when it happened, a child renamed Quiet, though she had once been called something else, something she could no longer recall. In her words, the Dallins believed children learn truth not by reading or reciting, but by enduring. What they called a lesson was not spoken in books or chalk. It was written in pain. She described the ritual in slow detail. The children were summoned one at a time, sometimes pulled from their beds after dark, sometimes chosen at random during mealtime. They were brought into a narrow chamber lined with brick. At the center stood a table. On it lay a small coal brazier glowing red with embers. Beside it, a single silver spoon rested across iron tongs. Katharina Dallin always prepared it, her hands calm, her expression soft, as if this were an act of nurture. She would lift the spoon, hold it over the coals until it burned crimson, then place it on a folded cloth before Elias summoned the child forward. The rule was simple. The child was not to speak their forbidden name. When asked, they were to accept the house name they had been given. If hesitation lingered, the spoon was raised. Elias would command them to open their mouths, not wide, just enough to place the searing metal between their teeth. The punishment was not the burn of flesh, but the unbearable nearness of it. The spoon was balanced so that the teeth clamped its handle, the bowl pressed close to lips that quivered but could not move. The heat radiated through the enamel, humming against the jaw, searing the air they breathed. They were told not to scream because screaming would only draw the fire deeper. The woman remembered the silence most of all. The chamber was soundproof, sealed so no echoes escaped, but even within it there was no crying. Only the hiss of metal as it cooled, and the faint tremor of a child's breath. Some fainted. Some held until the last flicker of heat was gone. Their lips blistered not from contact, but from the heat in the air. They left the room with teeth aching, jaws numb, voices fractured. They learned to fear their own mouths. They learned silence. One night, she recalled, a boy named Ash was brought forward. He had been caught whispering to another child, trying to remember the sound of his mother's voice. They placed the spoon between his teeth as always, but something went wrong. His breath caught. His throat spasmed, and in the struggle he swallowed wrong, pulling the heat into his airway. He convulsed, choking. The scream caught inside him like glass. By the time they pulled the spoon away, his body had gone slack. He was carried out, never seen again. The next morning, no one spoke of him. His bed was gone. His plate at the table left blank. The woman telling this story wept as she spoke. She said the ritual was never about punishment, but about possession. Elias told them often, the mouth was the doorway of self. To reshape the soul, you must cauterize the doorway. The spoon was not just a tool, it was a key, burning away memory, teaching the child that their own voice was unsafe. When she remembered the sensation, even 70 years later, she said she could still feel the ache in her molars as if the heat had fused with her bones. Historians who heard her testimony dismissed it at first. Too grotesque, too strange. But when the orphanage was finally raised, buried beneath the foundation near the eastern wing, workers uncovered a wooden crate filled with dozens of spoons. Each was tarnished, blackened at the bowl, the handles warped from repeated heating. Some bore faint etchings, letters carved by small hands, initials perhaps, though none matched any recorded names. The spoons were taken into evidence, then quietly stored away. The woman's testimony ended with a sentence no one could ignore. "We were never burned, not once. That would have been mercy. They only taught us to taste the heat and to know we could not scream." For a school that claimed to house more than 30 children each year, the town's records showed something deeply wrong. Between 1870 and 1895, the Dallin Academy received steady funding from the state, each grant tied to enrollment, each application listing between 30 to 42 children per year. That should have meant hundreds of names, hundreds of lives. Yet when the Brackenthorpe registrar reviewed the burial logs after the school's closure, only 12 child burials were listed in the entire county across the full span of the orphanage's operation. 12. All with unmarked stones, no dates, no surnames. The records had been accepted at the time without question. Children were transient. Orphans were rarely tracked. Some may have been transferred, others adopted. Those were the words Elias favored in his ledgers. But when the last of the orphanage files were retrieved from the half-collapsed storage office, something was uncovered that shattered even those hollow justifications. A single ledger, bound in thick, cracked leather, lay at the bottom of a charred cabinet drawer. Its cover was blackened as if scorched in a controlled fire, the corners stiff with heat damage. Inside, half the pages were torn, not gently removed, violently ripped as though someone had clawed them from the spine. The surviving entries were few, and all were written in Elias's meticulous hand. Each entry followed a format, a name, a symbol, a 3-digit number, and the phrase reassigned to silent order. The names were unfamiliar, not house names. These were full names, first and last, none of which appeared in any state registry or census. They had been used, however, briefly and then removed from the record. No surnames ever appeared on grant paperwork. Nowhere else had these identities been preserved. These names lived only on the pages that had survived the fire. It was the attic that revealed more. During demolition, a team assigned to clear roof beams noticed a strange echo behind the northern wall, a hollowness that didn't match the other sides. When they pulled away the plaster, they found a false space about 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Inside, hung carefully on twine strung between beams, were braids, human hair, aged and brittle with time. Each one tied at the end with a strip of faded linen. Most were short, children's hair, light brown, jet black, a few copper strands turned gray with dust. There were 37 braids in total. Attached to each braid was a small parchment tag. The tags had been carefully punched, threaded with string, and labeled in red ink. Names, full names. Some bore short phrases beneath them: obedient, recalled, vessel complete. Others bore only a date. Some had no notes at all, just the name alone. None of the names matched public adoption records. None appeared in the state's archive of educational transfers. And none had ever been assigned to the headstones in the Dallin plot. These were names that existed only here, in silence, kept not as remembrance but as trophies. The coroner's report later confirmed that several of the braids bore traces of blood at the roots, pulled, not trimmed. Whatever purpose they served, it wasn't sentimental. Some speculated that the braids were part of Elias's linguistic theories, that by removing the hair and labeling it, he believed he had severed the child's connection to their original identity. A kind of ritualistic unnaming. Others believed it was simpler than that. Control. A reminder that no name lived outside the walls of the academy unless he allowed it. A few of the parchment tags had survived intact enough to scan. When entered into modern ancestry databases, not one yielded a match. No descendants, no birth records, nothing. As if the children had been created and erased within the confines of the school alone. When the attic space was sealed for forensic analysis, one final note was found tucked behind the far beam. A scrap of folded linen wrapped around a rusted tag. On it was written a single sentence in trembling script. He said names could be burned, but ashes still whisper. The blueprint was first uncovered in 1956, decades after the Dallin Academy had been sealed, and long after the remaining records were thought lost or destroyed. It surfaced during the estate sale of a disgraced machinist named Abram Crewley, whose notebooks had been dismissed as the ramblings of a man obsessed with acoustics and failure. Among his sketches, rotating arms, faulty music boxes, brass bell chambers, one folio was different. Tucked in the back, stained with age and signed in ink not his own. It bore the title, Receptor Device for Vibration Correction, commissioned by Mr. E. Dallin. Summer term, 1878. At a glance, the machine resembled a small phonograph, though built not to play sound but to receive it. It was made for a child's neck, adjustable straps, padded chin rest, and a cone-shaped receiver that curved toward the throat. At its center was a spool intended to hold wax-coated wire designed to record vocal vibrations in real time. But the strange part wasn't what it recorded. It was what came next. According to the diagrams, the machine would measure disobedient tremors, marked by volume, pitch deviation, or tonal impurities, and signal a shock, not electrical, but mechanical. A piston embedded beneath the chin rest would jolt upward when a child's voice moved outside the range deemed acceptable. The threshold for this acceptable range was never defined, only marked with a red symbol resembling a cleft staff crossed out. Crewley never filed a patent. The device was never manufactured at scale, but his notes referred to multiple test units. 2 were completed, he wrote. A third rejected due to fragility of throat bone. That phrase alone caught the attention of the archivist who catalogued the sale. She sent copies of the pages to Brackenthorpe's Historical Society, and for the first time, the rumors surrounding the Academy's mechanical corrections took on a horrifying shape. Survivors had once spoken quietly of punishment chairs, strange restraints, soft leather against the throat, and a humming noise that pressed into the chest. But no one had believed them. Now there was proof. The design was real, the method intentional. Elias Dallin had attempted to turn discipline into machinery. In 1962, a state-sanctioned excavation was approved to survey what remained of the academy grounds. It was during this process that workers unearthed a series of warped brass fragments near the base of the old latrine trench, buried deeper than any plumbing should have been. At first, they were mistaken for parts of a broken organ or laboratory waste. But when cleaned, the fragments revealed curved metal bands stamped with serial notations, numbers followed by letters V1R, V2R, V3D. Inside the hollow chambers of these curved bands, investigators found remnants of cloth, hardened wax, and in 3 separate units, human teeth. Molars, small enough to belong to children. The wax bore faint, unintelligible ridges as though sound had once been recorded but degraded with time. No one could retrieve the original audio. But one pattern repeated. A low-frequency imprint consistent with sustained humming or forced stillness. No laughter, no speech, just long, flat vibrations, fear carried across wire. One device, less corroded than the others, had been sealed with twine and wrapped in fabric. Inside, beneath the debris, was a note handwritten on torn ledger paper. The ink had faded, but a single phrase remained legible. She tried not to sing. The implications were staggering. The machine had not simply punished speech, it had conditioned silence. By inflicting precise, mechanical feedback when a child's vocal cords dared to carry emotion, when they trembled from anger, quivered with fear, or broke with memory, the device taught the body to mute the soul. The correction became automatic, not just psychological but physical. Their voices, once symbols of identity, were now instruments trained to betray them. Modern analysts concluded that the design would have caused deep trauma to developing vocal structures. Muscle spasms, swallowing disorders, loss of pitch perception. One medical expert, after reviewing the diagrams, said it amounted to emotional vivisection performed through the throat. As for Elias, no personal writings described the device. He never claimed credit, but a payment ledger retrieved from the church archive showed a recurring donation made to Cruelly every month from 1878 to 1881. The notes listed only a single word: refinements. The recovered voice box fragments were eventually sealed in evidence storage, never placed on public display. The town deemed them too disturbing, too real. Even now, no museum holds them. But in the quiet spaces where archivists whisper what they've seen, they agree on one thing. The Dallin Academy did not just erase names. It reprogrammed the body to forget how to speak them. Katharina Dallin was never the one who raised her voice. She didn't strike, didn't scold, didn't threaten. To the outside world, she was the quiet heart of the orphanage, the maternal figure who served soup with both hands and sang hymns softly in the halls. But those who sat at her table understood otherwise. What she practiced wasn't discipline, it was precision. Her cruelty didn't bleed, it starved. At the Dallin Academy, meals were not for nourishment, they were tests. Every child had a designated seat at the long polished oak table that stretched beneath the stained glass dome in the dining chamber. Their house names were not spoken aloud, only engraved beneath their plates. But beneath those plates, scratched directly into the wood, were symbols, one per child, each hand-etched in careful lines. They changed weekly. No one ever saw them being carved, but every Monday when the children sat down, the markings beneath their dishes had shifted again. Katharina watched from the head of the table. She rarely ate. Her own plate remained pristine, untouched. Her eyes moved from child to child as they lifted their plates with trembling hands, revealing the new symbols, some geometric, others twisted, almost runic. She would wait, then speak in a voice barely above a whisper. What does it mean? The rule was simple. No eating until the symbol was explained. The answer had to be immediate, logical, and obedient in tone. There were no correct definitions, only the one Katharina deemed emotionally acceptable. If a child hesitated, fumbled, or gave an answer laced with fear or rebellion, their plate was removed. They were not shouted at. They were simply passed over. Their food went cold while others ate. One girl assigned the name Belle was given a symbol shaped like an inverted triangle crossed by a single line. She said it reminded her of a mountain. Katharina responded, "A mountain is pride." "What lesson does pride earn?" The child answered, "Hunger." She was permitted to eat. Another child, small, was given a circle with teeth-like notches. He said it looked like the sun. Katharina said nothing, just lifted the plate and placed it beside her. He did not eat for 2 days. Eventually, the children stopped describing what they saw. They began guessing what she wanted to hear, what emotion would please her, what metaphor would avoid her gaze. The symbols became nightmares. Some said they dreamed of them. Others saw them in the lines of their hands or behind their eyelids when they blinked. A few began to copy the symbols into their skin with pins or charcoal, hoping it would grant them food the next time. Not all endured. One child collapsed mid-meal, having not eaten for 3 days. He'd failed to explain the same symbol twice. The third time, his mouth opened but no words came. His fingers twitched. He fell sideways onto the floor. He was carried out of the hall and never returned. Over time, eating became an act of performance, not survival. Forks were held only when permitted. Knives were used with ceremonial stillness. No one reached, no one drank before being called upon. Those who succeeded in guessing their lesson too quickly were punished in subtler ways. A colder portion, a cracked spoon, a second test mid-meal. Katharina believed that hunger trained the conscience, that shame, paired with silence, bent the mind gently without needing to break it. Years later, when the academy had long been sealed and the table removed for auction, restorers flipped the wood and found 184 separate symbols carved into the underside, none repeated. Some matched no known alphabet, a few bore notches filled with what looked like dried blood. But most were clean, etched with surgical neatness, sharp as if made yesterday. The auction was cancelled. The table was never sold. It sits in a state archive warehouse covered in canvas, sealed in a crate that no one wants to open. Those who've seen it say they left feeling thirsty. Some say they couldn't eat for days. In 1978, a sealed envelope was discovered behind a false panel in the maintenance shed of the old Brackenthorpe Cemetery, where the last of the Dallin staff were once laid to rest. The letter was yellowed, brittle, addressed "To whom the earth still speaks," and signed only with the initials H.T., the groundskeeper who had worked the Dallin property until its closure in 1901. He had vanished without notice shortly after demolition began, presumed dead or simply forgotten. But his confession was real, written in an uneven hand that shook across the page, each sentence revealing something that had long been buried quite literally beneath the orchard's edge. He began by describing the girl. Said she never caused trouble. Said she never once disobeyed, but also never smiled. They had called her quiet, not because she was well-behaved, though she was, but because she seemed to lack language entirely. She did not speak. She did not gesture. She moved when told and froze when not. Her steps were soundless. She always sat nearest the east wall of the chapel where the stone was coldest. Her eyes blinked slower than the others. She was small, narrow-shouldered with a half-healed scar beneath one eye that no one ever explained. No one ever claimed her. No visitors, no letters. She arrived without a surname and none was ever written down. The confession continued with an incident from the autumn of 1893. The groundskeeper had been tending the orchard fence line when he saw 2 figures in the tall grass near the back tree, one standing, the other on the ground. As he approached, he recognized the girl, quiet, lying stiff among the weeds. Her face was pale, dirt pressed into her cheek, hands folded over her chest like she had been arranged. The other figure, taller, disappeared before he could get close. He never saw who it was. He never told. The girl's lips were sealed shut, not metaphorically, physically. Coarse metal wire crudely looped through the flesh, drawn in X's across her mouth. Dried blood had stiffened along her chin and her jaw looked broken, slightly offset. The groundskeeper had dropped to his knees, too shocked to cry out. He touched her neck, cold. But the skin hadn't grayed. She hadn't been dead long. He should have told someone. He admitted it in the letter. But the fear had taken him. Not fear of the law, fear of Elias, of Katharina, of what would happen if the others learned she had been found. Instead, he buried her. Behind the orchard's east row, beneath a linden tree with a split trunk, he dug the hole himself. Not deep, just enough to keep her from the animals. He placed no marker, no stone, only a single scrap of cloth he found clenched in her fist, an embroidered napkin from the chapel hall. He folded it and tucked it into her pocket, whispering that it was hers now, that someone remembered. He returned once a year later to place wildflowers on the grave, but when he reached the tree, the ground had been disturbed, dug up and covered again, but hastily. He dug down, panicked, and found the girl still there, but her mouth was no longer sewn shut. The wire was gone. In its place, her lips had been restitched with black thread, finer and neater, almost ornamental. Folded in her hands this time was a slip of parchment, soaked but still legible. It bore a symbol, a circle with a vertical line through it. Beneath it, a single word in red ink, heard. He reburied her, said nothing, but in the letter he begged for her to be found again. Not exhumed, found, named. In 1980, after the letter was authenticated, forensic teams attempted to locate the grave. Soil disturbances and linden root spread made it nearly impossible. No remains were ever officially recovered. But during the dig, they did find fragments of rusted wire, a linen scrap with faded embroidery, and one child's tooth, found separate, clean, resting above root line like it had been placed there. No records ever revealed who Quiet was. She appeared in no enrollment forms, no death record, no inquiry. No one had ever reported her missing, and so she remains a myth in the town's memory. The child who never spoke, whose silence became her identity, and whose voice, whatever it once was taken piece by piece, then sealed shut. One archivist later wrote in a journal, never published, that some silences are louder than screams, and that whatever Quiet once tried to say must have terrified the ones who taught her to be silent in the first place. The object was first found in 1911, stored inside a sealed cabinet beneath the debris of what had once been the science wing of the Dallin Academy. Covered in soot, its face had cracked into a spiderweb of fractures, but the brass housing beneath remained intact. Those tasked with cataloging the remnants assumed it was a clock. A strange one, yes, but still a timepiece of some experimental kind. It had a dial, it had a central spindle, it had a single hand that rotated slowly, hour by hour, around a shallow glass basin ringed by etched Roman numerals. But there were no gears inside, no weights, no escapement, only liquid. When archivists disassembled the housing 2 decades later, they found the true function beneath the surface. What they uncovered was not mechanical elegance, but something far more grotesque. Inside the basin, beneath the protective shell, lay a shallow tray lined with copper mesh. Above the tray hung a glass vial, cracked but still partially filled with a corrosive compound that was identified by chemical test as nitric acid. The drip was controlled by a slow-turning valve mechanism, regulated by the same hand they had assumed marked time. At each increment of the hour, the vial would release a single drop, steady, unrelenting, onto the tray below. What lay beneath the mesh had long since decayed, but not before leaving marks. Pinned across the surface were fragments of insect wings, carapaces, and hair-thin bones, too small for rodents, too rigid for birds. The acid had eaten clean through several layers of the brass plate beneath, leaving a pattern of circular burn scars spaced evenly, like the face of a sundial etched in pain. Each mark aligned precisely with a numeral on the rim. It was no clock. It was a timer for suffering. Katharina and Elias had once prided themselves on scientific correction. In lectures and private essays, Elias wrote of behavioral distillation, the belief that impulses, if interrupted at the moment of formation, could be rerouted into more desirable paths. He claimed that guilt was unreliable and punishment too noisy. But a slow, measured deterrent, the kind that allowed time to reflect while pain advanced by degrees, was more humane. He never described the devices he used. But those who studied the acid clock believed it was one of them. The prevailing theory among investigators was that the device had been used as a teaching aid, that insects had been placed beneath the drip to show the passage of time and destruction. But one surviving student, aged 90 and incoherent in most memories, told her granddaughter a different story before her death. She remembered a room with a table that was too clean and a metal basin that whispered. She said fingers were placed beneath it, not burned, watched. That the pain didn't come all at once, that it started cold, that the goal wasn't to maim, it was to teach a child how long they could hold still. No one believed her at first, but when forensic specialists revisited the clock's housing in 2007, they discovered 3 faint indentations along the rim of the basin, equidistant, shallow, and shaped like tiny finger rests. Not full hands, just placement points. Enough for 3 fingers held flat beneath the dripping vial. One for each lesson, perhaps, or each mistake. The acid over time had not just dissolved the tray. It had also left behind a distinct scent, faintly metallic, acrid, something that clung to the fingers of anyone who handled the device. Workers complained of phantom tingling, numbness in the tips of their thumbs. One historian who spent hours photographing the object claimed he developed a skin rash shaped like the numeral 9. It faded within days, but he never touched the device again. The acid clock was later sealed in an archival vault. Visitors are not permitted to view it directly. Its photographs are few, blurred, and unsettling. But one thing remains clear. It was never meant to tell time. It was meant to stretch it, to mark it out drop by drop, each second a warning, each hour a discipline that couldn't be outrun. And for the child forced to sit and watch it drip, knowing the burn would come slowly, predictably, inescapably, there was no relief. Only the lesson, only stillness, only the hand that kept turning. In Brackenthorpe, the sound of the bell at the Dallin Academy became as familiar as the turn of leaves. Each year in the early days of October, the bell would toll once, never more, never less, cutting through the morning fog like a blade. Townsfolk called it the Harvest Bell, a name that seemed harmless at first. Children were told it meant the school year had changed seasons, that it marked the shift from play to focus, from outdoor games to indoor discipline. But no one ever explained why the bell was never visible. No tower crowned the building, no rope hung in view. Yet the sound rang out, low, cold, almost mechanical in its flatness. What most didn't know or chose not to remember was that the bell only rang once each year, and each time it did, one child vanished. This truth emerged not from town gossip, but from a diary sealed in the vestry of the Brackenthorpe Church, written by a visiting clergyman named Father Erwin Gelles. In 1886, he had traveled to the academy to deliver a series of moral lectures. The Dallins welcomed him with rehearsed warmth, offering him tea, a guest room, and access to observe classes. But what he saw unsettled him. In entries scribbled late at night, he wrote of children who moved in rigid lines, who never called out, who seemed to change their posture whenever the Dallins entered the room. Then came the bell. He described the morning clearly. Fogged fields, no wind, and then the sound. A single chime, not from above, but from within. He wrote that it shook the glass in his window, but no others seemed alarmed. The staff offered no explanation. The children, however, became visibly altered. Their eyes lowered, their lips pressed together. And when they gathered for breakfast, something changed in the morning chant. The children at the academy began each meal with a recitation, a litany of names and values. Grace is still, noble is soft, steady as light. A strange catechism of house names paired with virtues. But on this morning, one name was gone. A girl called Soot had been part of the chant the day before. Now she was missing, and in her place, a new phrase appeared. Absence is purity. Father Gals asked about the girl. He was told she had been transferred, but there was no record of transfer. No carriage arrived, no bags packed. Her bed was made, her belongings folded, and the other children never spoke of her again. The diary revealed that over the next 3 autumns he returned to the town out of suspicion. Each time the bell rang, and each time a different name disappeared from the chant. Bell became echo. Hush became yield. Twitch became obedience. The names were not simply erased, they were absorbed, replaced by values the Dallins deemed more permanent. The ritual was quiet, never spoken aloud by adults, but practiced with religious precision by the children. It became clear to Father Gals that the naming day was not a celebration of identity but a shedding, a winnowing. The child removed was not mourned, not remembered, not even feared. They were transfigured into concept. Their loss became part of the Academy's doctrine. The fewer names remembered, the more pure the group. The bell itself was never found. No mechanism was located within the walls during demolition. No records of a casting. But it rang each year without fail, until the final year when the Academy was shut down and the land went quiet. Some believed the bell was symbolic. Others believed it was real, a part of some deeper machinery buried beneath the school. The diary was sealed not by accident, but by request. Father Gales left a final note to his superior, stating that the horror of the ritual lay not in the bell or the missing children, but in how completely the others accepted it. He wrote, "It is not death that haunts this place. It is the precision of forgetting." To this day, older residents of Brackenthorpe refuse to hear bell towers toll in autumn. Some claim the sound still comes once each year, faint and distant as the air sharpens and the trees begin to turn. No one speaks of the naming day anymore. But if you listen closely, very closely, you may hear a child's voice reciting a chant that no one taught them, naming no one at all, and ending with a word that chills the blood: purity. The chapel was meant to be the last part of the Dallin Academy torn down. It stood at the southern edge of the property, closest to the iron gates, with stained glass windows depicting nothing biblical, just abstract shapes and dark reds that never caught the light. The pulpit was made of ash wood, the pews narrow and unpadded, and beneath the altar sat a trapdoor no one had ever opened. Until 1983, it had been presumed decorative. But during a final excavation survey, a structural engineer struck something hollow while clearing soot-stained tile from the chapel floor. When the boards were lifted, what lay beneath them was not written in any plan nor spoken of in any recollection. Under 3 layers of brick and layers of compacted ash, a circular stone chamber revealed itself, buried so deep the team assumed it was a cistern or old crypt. But as more rubble was cleared, the shape became clear. It wasn't a storage pit, it was a room. And not just a room, a space designed for watching. Laid into the floor was a semicircular amphitheater carved directly into the stone foundation. 7 rows of benches descending in tight arcs, each wide enough for small bodies to sit shoulder to shoulder. The chamber was windowless, soundless. Every wall absorbed the light, making lanterns seem weaker than usual. And along the edge of each bench, single words had been etched in chiseled deep lines. The first bench read, "Still." The next, "Shame." Then mirror, "Nothing." Again, "Obedience." And at the very back, no one. In the center of the room, resting inside a shallow depression in the floor, was a circular trough lined with what at first appeared to be white stones, but as brushes cleared dust and time, the truth surfaced. They were teeth. Small, smooth, slightly yellowed with age, all of them milk teeth, human from children. Loose, scattered, piled, over 1,000 in total, carefully counted, catalogued, then sealed in evidence bags. None had roots. All had been removed clean. The investigators debated origin. One theory claimed the children placed them there voluntarily as part of a ritual, a severing of self, a symbolic end to innocence. Another argued that the teeth had been extracted forcibly, possibly under duress, as punishment for disobedience. But one forensic dentist noted something far more disturbing. The wear patterns on the molars indicated that many had been used longer than they should have. Children who should have lost them at age 7 or 8 had retained them into their early teens, as if they'd been told not to let them fall. The implication was chilling, that children were made to hold on to their baby teeth, that shedding them was delayed on purpose, preserved through unnatural pressure or force. And when finally taken, the teeth were not discarded, they were offered or collected. The amphitheater itself bore no exit, no stairwell led in or out. Only a single narrow passage curled up to the chapel floor, concealed behind the altar's foundation. The acoustics of the room were peculiar. Sounds dropped into the center echoed faintly up the rows, but never outward. Whispers stayed trapped. Screams would have dissolved into the stone. There was no pulpit here, no sermon. Only watching, sitting, learning. Etched into the wall behind the final row of benches were the only words written in full sentence form. Faint, nearly rubbed away. You are not your name. You are what is left when the name is gone. They sealed the chamber within a month. No museum asked for the teeth. No official report released photographs of the amphitheater. But among archivists and quiet scholars, the chamber became known by a single whispered name: the mouth. The silence around the Dallin Academy held for nearly a century. For generations, Brackenthorpe spoke of the building in vague terms. The old school, the reform place where the orphans went. No one called it by name. No one asked what happened to the children who entered and never left. But in 1996, a local journalist named Clara Bexley began asking questions no one wanted to answer. She had grown up hearing the stories, seeing the shuttered chapel, the boarded cellar windows, the orchard that never grew quite right. When her own daughter asked her what the stone tags near the cemetery meant, just initials carved into small slabs, no dates, Clara began digging. She filed open records requests. She visited state archives and read through scorched ledgers, damaged receipts, inspection reports with entire years missing. She found whisper-thin threads, supply orders for linens in child sizes, ration requests inconsistent with official head counts, and payments to names that never appeared elsewhere. But what she uncovered beneath the surface was far more damning, an intentional pattern of erasure. Dozens of children enrolled without family names, paper trails ending mid-sentence, transferred to homes that never existed, all stamped year after year with the Dallin family's signature. The state ignored her first 5 reports. Local officials dismissed her questions as conspiracy, but then she published a piece with a photograph no one had ever seen. A braided strand of hair tied with a name tag, recovered from the attic and smuggled into private hands before the room was sealed. The tag read, Martha Elise Kindred, age 9, no record of birth, no record of death. Just a braid, a name, and a silence that followed. Public pressure grew, quiet at first, then louder. Survivors, or what few were left, began speaking, Through adult children, through written statements, through sobs in half-finished interviews. One remembered a boy named Red, who vanished after speaking aloud his birth name. Another recalled a girl who bled at the gums for days before her teeth were harvested. No one remembered surnames, but faces came back, chants, symbols, scars. Finally, in 1998, the state launched a quiet investigation, classified not as criminal but as a historical anomaly review. It gave no press conference. It released no findings. But behind locked doors, forensics teams cross-referenced everything Clara had found. The spoon fragments, the acid-burned brass tray, the melted name tags, the voice box shells still packed with cloth and tooth. Across all artifacts, 82 distinct names were partially recovered. Some full, some initialed, some carved into linen, etched into desk bottoms, or whispered into failing tape recordings salvaged from private collections. A memorial was commissioned the following spring. It was not placed near the school or the chapel. Instead, it was built in the orchard, at the site where the girl called Quiet had once been buried. The design was simple. 7 stone benches arranged in a semicircle mimicking the chamber beneath the chapel. In the center stood a tall black obelisk unmarked by cross or quote, engraved with 82 names, fragmented, incomplete, some with only a first name or initial, others labeled simply unknown. Beneath each was a single word, chosen based on testimony, waited, listened, yielded, vanished. The memorial drew quiet crowds. No large ceremony was held, no state apology was issued, but the names were there now. They could be read aloud. Clara continued her investigation for 2 more years. In 2001, she published a follow-up titled The Name Collector. In it, she revealed a final thread. One remaining Dallin heir, a man living under a changed name in southern France, whose immigration records matched the original signature of Elias's nephew, Tobias Dallin, last seen on a train in 1902. When confronted, the man refused comment. He vanished within days. French officials confirmed he boarded a ship to Morocco and was never traced again. Today, the Dallin Academy no longer exists on maps. The land was sold to a conservation trust, the ruins fenced off, trees left to grow wild. But the orchard is open, people come quietly, some bring flowers, others bring spoons. One boy left a baby tooth wrapped in cloth. No one touches it. Because now, at last, the names are no longer hidden, and someone somewhere is still listening. In the end, the Dallin legacy isn't measured by buildings or books. It isn't the awards mounted on crumbling academy walls, or the carefully worded praise once printed in state education reports. It isn't even the grave markers that bear no names. What the Dallins built was something far more permanent. A structure made of silence, polished, methodical, and nearly invisible. They didn't murder with knives. They dismantled with language. They replaced identity with obedience, rewrote names into symbols, and turned memory itself into contraband. Elias believed that names made children weak, that to remove a name was to remove the self, and that what remained, if shaped in silence, could be something better, something pure. He didn't shout, he taught. He lectured in calm tones about phonetics and moral architecture, all while children sat in rows, afraid to speak their birth names even in dreams. Katharina didn't beat or bruise. She smiled, served food in rituals of deprivation, and watched as children trembled over symbols they were told to explain. Even when those symbols made no sense, they called this love. They called it reform. But it was erasure. Over 80 children entered those doors and never left behind so much as a surname. Their voices were stripped, their teeth removed, their identities pinned to wire tags or burned into wooden desks or worse. Never written down at all. They were renamed, reassigned, repurposed into virtues that demanded suffering to uphold. And every year when the bell rang, one of them disappeared, not with violence but with ceremony, not with blood but with logic. That's how evil endured here, not through chaos but through quiet. The horror wasn't just what the Dallins did, it was how easily they did it. How many watched, how many helped. Teachers followed instructions, clergy looked away, townspeople nodded along when Elias spoke of reform. State officials signed grant checks with open hands and closed eyes. And when the children vanished, no one asked where they'd gone, because the ones who disappeared had already been made invisible. Even now, the evidence sits sealed in boxes labeled sensitive material. The acid clock, the stitched cloth, the voice box casings, the names carved beneath plates. Archivists whisper of symbols still found on torn scraps decades later. Drawn in the margins of old notebooks, scratched into the wood of abandoned desks, burned faintly into the underside of a chapel bench. The rituals left traces, as all rituals do. But the hardest trace to erase is silence. Once taught, it replicates. Once normalized, it survives. And at the center of it all remains a portrait. 20 children, 2 adults, no names, faces that don't smile, don't plead, don't resist, just stare. As if the canvas itself has held its breath for over a century, waiting for someone to ask who these children were. Who they might have been had someone called them by their names. Somewhere, in a locked archive drawer, there's a burned ledger with a few names still legible, a few brave enough to survive paper, flame, and time. They are listed now on a memorial stone in a forgotten orchard, beside braids of hair and the ground that holds more questions than roots. The Dallins built their empire on the lie that silence was peace. But silence is not peace. Silence is a decision. And every time it is chosen, something or someone is lost again. What do you think? Was this methodical madness or something worse? And could it happen again if we let silence teach?